So, welcome everybody to another installment of Project Management from UX. So, my name is Itamar Medeiros. I'm a graphic designer by background, originally from Brazil, but for the last 10 years I've been living in Germany, and I've been doing I've been creating experiences for the last 25 years. For the last 10 years, I've been doing a lot of design management and strategy. So what I'm sharing in this series are things that I've learned the hard way. The if you're joining us for the first time, this is the fourth part of a 5-part series around project management. And in the part one, we cover provide vision and direction. It's part two. We talked about coach and mentor team members. The last part, we talked about negotiation, issue, and conflict resolution. Today, we're going to be talking about effective decision making. If you're wondering why these 5 skills, these are the 5 skills recommended by the Project Management Institute, or PMI. These particular skills, one could argue that this is not just for UX. This is basically for anybody who wants to help teams get unstuck, and provide vision, making sure that everybody's walking pattern in the same direction. You might not have the official title of project manager on a team, but my experience is that if you are familiar with these skills and you are aware of these techniques, either you can help the person that has that title, or you can step up to the plate and help teams get unstuck. So if you're not gonna have time to watch the whole video, let's just talk about 3 key points that I think are particularly important for us in this discussion today. When we're talking about effective decision making, in the context of UX, most of the times you're not the only person on the team, right? Say very few projects, at least in my experience, very few projects in UX, the designer can execute everything from end to end, right? Most of the times you have to work with especially if you're talking about enterprise software, you're working with a larger team, product managers, software developers, user testing, user assistants, and so on. So most of the times decision making happens in the context of a team, right? So in this case here, for the purpose of this talk, we're going to be talking about decision making as a facilitation process, right? The challenge, though, is that most of the times when we use this word facilitating, people tend to think about facilitating meetings or facilitating workshops, which is a valid use of the word, but for the purpose of what we're trying to do here in terms of getting teams to paddle in the same direction, is not just about facilitating the meeting or the workshop, but getting the team to agree on what is the course of action. Specifically, if we're talking about once we decided what we're going to do next, how do we get people to commit and execute on the decision, right? So that means that it's not just a workshop, it's not just facilitating a meeting, is what are the activities that need to happen in order for us to decide something, and then making sure that we commit to the decision and commit to a course of action, right? The other thing that I think is really critical to understand is like what a good decision looks like. We can be perfectly happy with the decision, and I think I've seen a lot of teams fall into this trap. Is like we arrived at a consensus, we're all happy with the decision that we make, just to realize that this is that the decision falls through later, right? So for the purpose of what I consider a good decision, is a good decision to help the people get closer to the goals that they have, right? So if you go back to part 1 of this series, we talked a lot about vision and direction, right? So any decision that we're making as a team should help us get closer to our goals, right? So if our goals are not clear, if we don't have a clear vision, any decision is a good decision, and we might realize that it's not going to get to it might take us to a place that we do not want to be later, right? I've seen a lot of teams that, let's say, they made a decision a few years back, now they're stuck with that decision, and it's really hard and expensive to revert that decision, right? The second part is, a good decision is made with the most relevant information available. And the key word here is most relevant information, not all the information. Because I see, this is also a challenge that I see a lot of teams have. Like they get stuck with analysis paralysis, right? Let's say, oh, if I do more user research, or if I collect more data, or if we had the answer to this question and that question, and then people just get stuck and they never decide because they feel that there's something else to learn, right? So at some point, we need to be able to live, well, maybe live is too strong, but we need to tolerate a degree of uncertainty and ambiguity in order to make a good decision. Because sometimes it's actually better to just make a decision and move on, observe the results of the decision, and iterate and course correct later, than just keep getting stuck, right? And probably the most important thing that I think that helps team get unstuck is, a good decision is based on priorities that people care about, right? And people here means most likely the stakeholder that you're working with, right? So I've seen a lot of teams get stuck because priorities keep changing all the time, or there's a misunderstanding around what priorities is. So people keep working on something just to realize that's something that they're working on doesn't really help, right? So this clarity of priorities up front is going to help a lot. And probably the most important thing here to understand is this: if we can't make the right decisions quickly and effectively, but probably the most important thing is like, if you can't execute on those decisions consistently, your business is going to lose ground, right? So I had a very wise manager that says it like this: whatever speed that you're moving, if your competitor or whoever you are playing on the same space is, it doesn't take that person to be an incredibly faster speed to overcome you. Just think of, let's say, the metaphor of driving a car, right? Let's say if you're on the road driving 100 miles an hour, well, I guess let's say in Germany it would be possible to be riding 100 miles an hour. But let's say if you're driving on let's say 60 miles an hour, all it takes for the someone coming from behind to be driving 1 mile an hour faster than you, that person will eventually overtake you. Same thing with business, right? Let's say sometimes they don't have not necessarily the better technology, they don't have more skills, they might not even have more people working on projects, but because they are able to execute, they are able to make right decisions and execute on those decisions consistently. If they are consistent on that execution, they might end up being just a little faster than you, and that's enough to, on the long term, to overtake you, right? So let's talk about effective decision making, right? So I think I mentioned in the beginning, to me, facilitation here means agree on a course of action, right? So and here the key, let's say if you're joining this, if you're jumping on this video just now, here are the key 3 pieces of a good decision, right? Help people get closer to their goals. Is made with the most relevant information available, and is based on priorities that people care. So we're going to be talking about these 3 key points here in a second. But here's the part in the middle, I think, is really important, right? the most relevant information available means not only you not only you're not talking about every single piece of information available, because then that will means that you might run into the risk of getting on analysis paralysis, right? Let's say you're always looking for more information. But the key word also here, the second part of the sentence is like available. So that means that it's okay to actually go back and revisit a decision if you learn something new, right? You discover something new, or in the case, let's say, for example, especially if you're looking at most of the lean or agile methods when it comes to project management and development, most of the times you're coming up with hypotheses, testing and iterating, right? In the process of iterating, putting something in the world and observing the results of testing your hypothesis, it's okay to change your mind, right? Let's say it's okay to go back and course correct your decisions, right? But of course, it's always better to have those changes or have those iterations to be something that you purposely planned for it, right? Let's say it's not like you're discussing something completely out of the blue that you have no idea from the get-go. It's always better to have those discoveries or the information, that information that arrives new, to not be completely new, right? But here's something that I observe, and this is a challenge that I think for a lot of teams here is especially in the corporate world, there's always this pressure for people to make decisions, right? Let's say we always seem to be in this rush to, because of this pressure of competition and stuff. A lot of teams feels under the pressure that like we have to decide quickly. And I think I mentioned in the beginning that, let's say, the core, like the business needs to make the right decisions quickly. That's fine. The challenge, I think, is that sometimes people use the pressure, or let's say they think that relying on, instead of making a very systematic decision making process or coming up with a very structured way of making decisions, they just relied on instincts, right? I say, and there's quite a lot of hype on the industry about this, like very instinctive decision makers, right? I say you have great leaders like, I don't know, Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. There's this, people get this impression that these people are just instinctively, they can make decisions really really quick because they have a gut feeling and so on. I think there's a degree of good decision making that happens on the instinct, but that instinct comes from many years of experience, right? Let's say if you make tons of decisions in the past around a specific subject, and you learn from the mistakes that came from those decisions, at some point, yes, your instincts might end up leading you to make very good decisions. But for most people, those hunches don't substitute good judgment, right? Let's say, so what we're going to be talking about here in the next few minutes is how to come up with a systematic way of making good decisions. First thing to be aware of is the biases, right? Let's say we cannot, the more that we snap into a decision by just coming up with the first thing that comes across our minds, is that we run in the risk of having biases, and we, unfortunately, we're not going to have time to cover all the biases that there are, but biases are these basically these glitches on our thinking that we tend to, let's say, our brains are designed to make the very efficient use of energy, right? So if we don't have to sit through and make very deep intellectual thought through decisions, the brain will prefer to just let's say, just go through, let's say, our archive of previous assumptions and then jump, let's say, propose a solution, right? Unfortunately, those decisions tend to be based on these biases that are these glitches, and then they end up actually hurting our decision making process. And I'm afraid I'm not going to have time to cover all the biases here, but let me give you a few, right? um I'm gonna share the link of a couple of resources later. But for I guess maybe we could spend a few minutes talking about some of the biases. um the one that I think the teams tend to suffer the most, especially if you're talking about user experiences, is the fourth one there on the screen, called the conforming evidence trap, right? The idea here is that if your team came up with a hypothesis and then you design something, you create a prototype, and then you put in front of customers to do some sort of concept validation or usability testing. If the first person that you put the concept in front of says, like, this is great and blah blah, most of the times the team is happy, is like, great, so that means like we were right. And then we discount the opposing information, right? So this is what the conforming evidence trap is the idea here is that instead of designing experiments to purposely refute your original hypothesis, you do the other way around. It's like you design an experiment, or for example, in this case, a usability test that makes it very easy for people to pass the test and kind of confirm that your original idea was great, right? Just to make sure that I don't get misunderstood, these biases is not that, well, unless team members are in bad faith and they are purposely designing things like to trick the user. Most of the times, these biases are things that people are not even aware of, right? Let's say it's just human nature. We if we don't have a systematic way of double checking our own thoughts, we just fall into these traps, right? For example, that's another one that is very typical here, like the sunk cost trap bias, which inclines us to make choices the way that justify the past choices, right? The most classical example is, especially as a user experience designer, I faced this in many times in my career, is like you propose a design, and then the first reaction that you get from the team is, but that's not how our backend works. It's like, you know, so basically it's like you try to say like, well, this design doesn't work because our system behaves this way, right? Well, that's true, right? Say that's how your system behaves today, but doesn't necessarily mean that the system should continue to behave this way in the future, right? Oh, we make basically, let's say when people say like, yeah, but that's not how our backend works. Basically, you're saying like, well, we made a bunch of decisions in the past, regardless if those decisions were the best ones. And now we are basically using those decisions in the past to justify future choices, even if those choices are mistakes, right? And let's say if you've been in enterprise software for a while, you've probably seen some of these, right? Say I work with some systems that have a legacy of 20, 25 years. And the longer that the longer that the legacy code stays there, and usually, unfortunately, the more successful the company is, the more likely is that we're gonna get stuck on that sunk cost trap there, right? Sometimes is some, and here's usually the way that I've kind of handled some of these conversations, like, yeah, but I'm not saying that we should ignore the backend, but like, have we done the math of what it would take to actually change it? Because sometimes changing and creating something from scratch might end up actually being cheaper and faster and more scalable in the long run. It's just that we are just so afraid of, let's say, yeah, but we made this decision in the past, especially if someone that, like, especially if you were part of that decision-making process, then you're kind of like afraid of looking back and making other decisions, right? So another one, and I'm afraid this is the last bias I'm gonna talk about, and then we have to move on, is the framing trap, right? This is probably the most critical one that prevents people from making good decisions, because the framing trap is about you misstate the problem, right? Let's say there's something, and for the lack of a better word, there's something wrong with your framing of the problem, or you're stating the problem in a way that doesn't really like undermine the decision making process. And usually the typical examples of this is this: you make an assumption based on the wrong persona, right? Let's say, so for example, you state a problem that doesn't exist for a specific group of people that you're trying to deal with, right? So for example, let's say you're creating a product for young families, or for single mothers, or for people with disabilities. And then whatever problem you're stating, that group of people that you're trying to design for doesn't perceive the problem in the same way, or for all that matters, for them, that's a problem that they don't care about. So this is an example of a framing trap. And I'll make sure that you have access to some of these references, so you can check the description of the video later. So so as I was mentioning earlier, if you can make the right decisions quickly and effectively, and probably more important, if you can't execute those decisions consistently, your business will lose ground. And here's something: there's a couple of two things that, I mean, apart from having a good, very consistent decision-making process that's gonna help, there's basically two big bottlenecks that I think you kind of need to clear, right? The first bottleneck is the roles and responsibilities, right? The most successful companies use very simple tools to help them recognize potential bottlenecks, and usually the first one is kind of decision roles and responsibilities. Who has the decision making power, quote unquote? I'm making air quotes here, right? And here I just wanted to make sure that I'm not misunderstood here. The power, people tend to associate this decision-making power with literally the actual power. And if you think about, for example, heads of state or figures of authority, right, like a president or prime minister or a king, people have this romanticized idea that, let's say, once you get that title, once you get to that position, you get to decide anything, or you get to decide everything. Well, if you're a dictator, probably that's the case, right? But if you are a good leader, most of the times, and actually one could argue that the more compassionate and the more you listen the people that you're leading, the more likely that decision is going to stick, right? So it's not like whoever has the decision making power gets to decide on some sort of ivory tower without listening to everyone. They can try. Let's say, for example, you have the title of project manager, or you have the title to product manager, and because you think that that's your title, that you get to decide that, most likely it's like, well, I decided this, but without consulting with anyone. Most likely that decision is not going to last long, because people either that decision is going to be hard to implement, or I guess kind of the most sinister part of the whole kind of project collaboration is people are going to passively resist to that decision because they were not involved in that decision. So there's a couple of tools that you can use to kind of clear the decision-making process, especially when it comes to roles and responsibilities. One of them, we talked about a few of them when we were in the second part of this series, when we were talking about facilitating decision-making, when you have things like the team canvas and so on. But another one that I find it very useful is the Uxi Matrix, right? Where before, especially if you're forming a new team, it will be very helpful to have very clear, assigned, and predefined, pre-agreed upon roles and responsibilities, right? Who's responsible for a decision, or for, I guess in this case, be even more precise, who's responsible for a specific artifact or outcome. Who is accountable for that, right? So the person that provides the final review and deems completion, right? Who's consulted, right? What are the people that we, let's say, who's consulted here in the case of, let's say, who are the people that we need to gather information from, either because they are the experts on that field, or because, I guess in this case, from an engagement perspective, is these are the people that if we don't hear from them, we might having, instead of them being our allies, they might end up kind of resisting the decision later, right? Or who are the people that are informed? And probably these are the ones that tend to be kind of in the soft skills, in the soft part of the influence side of things, right? Say some people are not directly involved in the execution, but they have some sort of influence over your domain. So it would be good to keep them informed because they might provide you support later, right? My experience is that a lot of the decision-making process gets stuck because we think that we have these roles clarified, but we don't in practice, right? You know, it's like in the in the day-to-day of the project, everybody has an opinion about everything. Everybody keeps saying like, we should do this, we should do that. And then the designer gets stuck on this crossfire. Okay, but should I, there's like, I don't know, at any given meeting, there's 17 people in the room. Who should I listen to? Well, I guess you could listen to everybody, but when it comes to the decision making, there should be clarity around who's making the decision around what, right? And here's the part that, let's say, comes with a little bit of experience. Most of the times it's not like unless you work on a very structure in a product team that they've been doing this for many years. My experience is most likely it's not like you're gonna show up on a project and there's gonna be a clear table like this, right? So, and even if you are, let's say, especially designers, my experience is like as a designer, you keep moving from one project to the other. So in one project you might have something like this, and then the next project you kind of have to restart everything. So there's a couple of things that I strongly suggest that you do. The first day you show up to any kind of project that you've been assigned to is like you ask, literally like, do we have a Uxi Matrix? Or maybe people might not be familiar with the name Uxi, but you might say like, do we like how do we make decisions around here? Or like, who are the stakeholders? Who's accountable for? And you can start using this language of clarifying the roles and responsibilities. So this is step number one. And if the answer is like, well, there's not, depending on like what kind of language people use back to you, then you might get a feeling that is not very clear, right? So the other thing that you can do is like you step up to the plate. It's like, hey, maybe it would be great if we had a Uxi Matrix for our project, right? So the other thing that, and this is basically, this is gonna be a overarching thread in this whole series of talks is most of the teams that are very effective, regardless if they have these processes or they have a product manager, a project manager, or a program manager, in the end of the day, if the teams have a clear understanding, a shared understanding, like what is the vision of what they're trying to achieve and what are the problems they're trying to solve, most of these issues that we've been talking about in this series would just kind of resolve themselves, right? So what we're seeing today, some of the some of the techniques that I'm going to share with you now is just more ways of creating this shared understanding, right? Shared understanding, one could argue that it will naturally evolve or naturally appear if teams have been working long enough on together. My experience, at least, is that a lot of companies go through kind of reorgs, and you are Your team has been working together for, I don't know, 2-3 years. Then all of a sudden a reorg comes and then we move things around. The other thing that probably is even more common is people move on, right? Let's say this person used to be the program manager of your team, but then that person decides to leave the company or the project, and then that person moves on, someone else comes in, right? So you need to have consistent tools and framework. Like you have to have tools and frameworks that consistently help the team create this shared understanding. And one of them is, and I think we talked on part 1 of this series, is a product vision, right? And product here, replace product with whatever is the unit of the project that you're working on. Let's say maybe you're not working on the complete product, but you're working on a feature, right? So every time you see the word here, product, replace product with whatever is the scope of that you're working on, right? And so on part 1 of this series, we talked a lot about how product vision helps the team create the shared understanding of like why we're building something and what is the value proposition of that something is for the customer, right? So if we, I mean, at least my experience is like if we were to get this one thing right, most of the problems that we're talking about here become a lot easier to resolve, because we could ask something like this: at any decision-making point of our life cycle, of product life cycle, we could just ask this simple question, right? Does this thing that we are working on right now, or is this decision that we're making, help us get closer or farther away from vision? And basically, this is like every time that you're working on facilitating this decision making, you should have these kind of questions in mind, right? You have to have for the lack of a better word, the artifacts in place to help the team answer questions like this, right? Day 1 of the project, does this get us getting any closer to our vision? Oh, we don't have a vision. Good. Let's work on a vision. Once that vision is in place, then we're making a decision about scope, about timelines, about anything. Well, does this decision, whatever is that we are deciding now, help us get closer or far away from vision, right? Then at some point, vision is not enough. At some point, let's say now is all about the execution, right? Say the how, and some projects tend to be very technical. So some of the decisions tend to be, let's say, very deep into the underbelly of the backend and things like APIs and things like this. Even those, you could argue, good, but will this API that we are deciding to build help us move faster or slower towards our vision? Right, so so and here are a couple of things that we talked about last we've been talking a lot about in the past few sessions or few parts of this series, right? So the strategy, and I know that this is a project management series, and a project management is all about tactics, but there is no point of trying to project manage something that doesn't have a clear vision and strategy, right? The strategy is about why we're working on something. Or actually, let me put it this way. The why is the vision, right? Let's say, what is our aspirations? What is our challenge? What we will focus on. So the strategy is like, what are the choices, the combination of all these choices that we're making of things that we want to work on that'll help us get to our vision. Or in this case, probably some of the most important ones, like, what is that we're not going to work on? Talking about focus, that will help us get closer to our vision, right? So now let's talk, okay, with these two bottlenecks cleared, right? Let's say roles and responsibilities and a good vision. How else can we make good decisions? So here, the one thing that I learned in my career is this: it's not so much about I know this is kind of, it sounds contradictory to some of the things that I shared in the first part of the series. But let's say, while vision is all about the why, and usually we are supposed to stay, let's say, try to understand the why as much as possible. A good decision making process, as a process definition, is all about the how. Let's say, is this process of decision making process that you have, let's say, thorough enough? And here's what, in my experience, proves to be like a good criteria for making sure that you have a good decision making process. Like, well, first is focus on what is important. Right? Going back to the criteria of a good decision. In this case here, the decision-making process is based on, for example, what is important is, like, do we have a clear vision? Do we have a good strategy? Is the process of making decisions logical and consistent, right? Let's say, if we were to look back of, let's say, towards the end of the project life cycle, if we were to look back and make a retrospective, regardless if the decisions that we made were good or bad, is it easy to justify why we make the decisions, right? Let's say that's what the criteria of, like, what logical consistent means, right? Let's say, if you cannot look back and say, this is why we make the decision, people are going to challenge them, why did you even make the decision in the first place, right? Another aspect of a good decision-making process is it takes in consideration both subjective and objective factors. I know that I said that people tend to be a little bit too much on the kind of gut feeling side of things, but we should not discard this, right? Let's say there's quite a lot of decision-making that has to happen with the lack of information at hand. We need to be able to make decisions that take also subjective criteria in mind, especially when we're talking about decisions that involve the human factors of things. Obviously, talking about relevant information, right? So decision-making process should be based on real information, or at least informed opinions, right? So if we're going to take in consideration something that we don't have data on it, but at least it's based on the input of someone that has 20 years of experience on it. Even though, let's say, even though we should always come up with a plan of, let's say, how do we validate that those opinions or information are correct, right? And the last part is, it requires only as much information and analysis is necessary. And here's the part that I think is really important here, is I've seen kind of the two extremes. Let's say people make decisions with no information whatsoever, just based on pure hunches and gut feeling. And I guess one could argue, let's say, if the weight of a decision is not great, let's say, or if the cost of reversing that decision is very low, it's okay to make decisions based on no information, right? Because you can always reverse and iterate again. But the higher the cost of reversing that decision later, the more critical is that you make decisions based on good data and information. The challenge is, then it becomes, let's say, how much information do you actually need to collect in order to make a decision? Because if you get stuck, let's say, if people seem to never make a decision because they keep, let's say, iterating and revisiting the decision based on more information that arrives, then it's no good either. I say the so-called analysis paralysis, right? So here are a couple of, if we're talking about systematic ways of making decisions, here are a couple of, not a couple, it's actually 5 methods that I've been recommending teams to use. Each method has a pro and con. Some of them are more thorough. Some of them are quicker. So I think it's up to you to to use your judgment in terms of, let's say, at what stage of the decision-making process we are in the team, how much time can the team spend of really wrestling with the decision that they need to make. so that we can make sure that we made a good decision. The first one is probably the most straightforward, in a sense that, let's say, is basically a checklist, right? So it's called the PROACT decision making process. PROACT stands for problems, objectives, alternatives, consequences, and trade-offs, right? So as you're discussing a decision, either a personal decision you're making or something that you working with a team, you literally, if you're able to elicit from the team, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What is the objective of this project, of this feature? What the alternatives we have? And this is something I wish I had more time to talk about it. But the one thing that you're gonna see that is very common across all these processes here is the alternative part. So let's say, as a designer, you need to really help the team to get to generate alternatives so that you have more than one option to pick from when you're making decisions. What I like about the PROACT is the last two parts, right? Say the consequences and the trade-offs, because a lot of things that you see, look at the world around you, and a lot of the mess that we are today is that because someone made a great, what they thought was a great decision at that time, but they never took the time to understand the consequences, right? Of course, let's say it's very hard to predict unintended consequences, but just spending some time to think, let's say, if we were to follow through with this decision, what impact we're going to have on our team, our company, our customer base, and probably be more important just to think about sustainability, like what in the world, right? Whoever created plastic, for example, I don't think they realize that plastic will take thousands of years to degrade in the environment, right? Let's say now we have like the big pollution problem that we have today because of the unintended consequence of putting something in the world without taking in consideration what are the long-term effects of that decision. And then the trade-offs, right? Say, once you have alternatives, let's say, well, in most teams, they tend to jump to the solutions like, well, the best option is the one that delivers the fastest results, right? Say, or is the one that is cheaper, especially software development. I see a lot of teams is whatever we can put in our backlog. Let's say, like, we put in our backlog the largest amount of options that fit into the timeline, right? Regardless if these are the right features or these are the features that deliver the biggest value to the customer, or the ones that help us get closer to our vision, right? The trade-off, let's say, be able to articulate the trade-off. Let's say if we were to build this one, this will take longer, but this will help us get closer to our vision. So it's probably worth spending, like, while this one is like, yeah, we can deliver this one, but the value, like, what is the value compared to the other items on our backlog, right? So the PROACT, I think, is really good when he brings all these perspectives there. Six thinking heads is another very famous decision-making process, because basically what happens is it breaks the thinking. Let's say I've seen a lot of teams doing brainstorming, right? Say when you generate a lot of ideas, what the six thinking heads does is this very structured way of, let's say, you consider all the facts, you generate ideas, you analyze the benefits of each one, you consider the drawbacks and so on. You take in consideration emotions and gut feelings. I personally think it's probably the most complete decision-making process or decision-making technique or facilitation technique when it comes to decision-making. Is the hardest one to execute because you really need a very strong facilitator. In this case, you need a six thinking head coach to help the team go through this. I've done a number of six thinking heads, and what I notice is, like, it makes the team very uncomfortable the first time they try it. But once they go through the process, and then the quality of the results, they say, like, can we do more of it? And it's like, so as long as you have a strong, a trained facilitator to do the six thinking head session, then let's say it's probably the easiest, because it's is like it takes little or no preparation at all, but is the one that usually it generates the best results, in my opinion. Right. The third one is like weighting your options. It's so simple and it's so intuitively that I'm kind of surprised that not a lot of teams take that one. This is what's proposed by Scott Beckham in his book Making Things Happen. But basically, it's like the weighting your options is like going back to something that I mentioned that is common across all these processes here, right? You can only make your decision is only as good as your best alternative. So you have to have alternatives to make a good decision. So once you have alternatives, once you have options, then what is the weight of your options, right? Basically, that's what it means, right? Is there an option in your process, for example, that says do nothing? Well, like what it will happen to the project if we decide to do nothing, right? To, for example, not worry about. And here's something that this is a very painful conversation I've had with some product teams. Is this? Sometimes we are under pressure of like, well, we need to deliver, we need to push this feature to this release. And even if it takes for us to kind of descope something that is actually the most critical part of the feature or something, let's say, or sometimes we descope something that makes the feature completely useless. And having a do nothing option includes something like this. What if we were to do nothing and kind of keep working on this feature release and put it next release? Because here's what the do nothing option does for us is this. Sometimes, and I'll argue that most of the times, if we were to do nothing, literally means like not release a feature, we actually end up not hurting the experience of, it's like if the users get, let's say, next release, they get the same amount of features that they have today. They get a product that they know like what is the current value, they know how it works. So do nothing actually end up being sometimes a better option than doing something half finished that actually hurts the user experience, right? The other, and then you just keep going through the options, right? I say, how do we know what we know? Like if you're comparing the options, how do we know that what we know, right? Do we have descending options, right? Say, for example, like the team feels very strong about option A, but there's a small minority of the team that thinks otherwise. We usually, most of the times, we kind of like discount the opinion of the dissenting opinion. But if we were to listen to the dissenting opinion, we might end up finding value from it, right? What if there were hybrid choices? Like what if we were to combine option A and B? Which kind of it leads into the integrative thinking proposed by Professor Roger Martin and his colleagues, Jennifer Rio, right? So integrative thinking comes from this very counterintuitive approach that, let's say, the best way to make a decision is confront the tension, right? So you have 2 opposing views or 3 opposing views or 10 opposing views. And the integrative thinking is like you let them, you create the models, or instead of trying to think about the solutions individually, is like you try to describe what are the models behind each of the solutions or the options, and just face the tension, right? And generate the alternatives that contain elements of all the opposing models, right? And here's something that is really counterintuitive. Is that, at least in Professor Martin's opinion, is like the stronger the tension, or I guess in this case, the more opposite the models are, the better the solution will be in terms of like when you combine elements of both positions. And I'll just throw the last one out there, the better decision, fewer regrets. And this is something related to kind of storytelling and vision that I feel very fond of. The better decision, fewer regrets. It's coming from Andy Stanley, the management guru. It basically has this very simple concept, which is like think of the story that you want to tell after you made this decision. Or in this case, going back to something about vision that I think is very critical here. Let's say if you look time travel to the future once you completed this project, what is the story that you want to tell? What kind of decisions have you made? Are you proud of those decisions? Right? So that's gonna help you make better decisions. I wish I had more time to talk about all these decision-making processes, but I'm gonna make sure that you have references to all of them. So I'll just share really quickly about the six thinking hats, right? The six thinking hats is about the idea of you. It comes from the assumption that different people have prefer ways of thinking, right? I say some people tend to be very optimistic, which means that they tend to focus on the benefits, right? Some people are very creative and they tend to have lots of ideas really fast, but then they are not very good in judgment. Other people are very analytical, right? They say they want looks at facts and figures and so on. And other people are very negative, right? They say they tend to, like, whenever an idea is thrown, they tend to look at the negative side of things. So what the six thinking hats does is, like, as the session progresses, you literally you're forcing the team to stay in one thinking thought process, right? So basically, I'll just give one example here. Like the six thinking hats coach will say, now let's put our white hat on and let's look at all the facts of this decision. Or what are the facts related to, like, what are the aspects of the data that we need to collect for making this decision. And usually that should force people to not put hunches or gut feelings on it, right? Or let's put our green hats on it and do a little brainstorming of what are alternatives. That part is really easy. A lot of people are familiar with brainstorming, right? But what people are not very good at is like, if you're kind of the negative person, is like you start judging the opinions, and then the six thinking hat person will say, well, we're not judging, we're just creating alternatives. Then let's put our yellow hat on and ask the question, what will have to be true for any of these ideas to work? Usually that's where the people that are in the negative side of things, or the people that tend to think of drawbacks, they kind of help them switch from just this is why this is not going to work. They tend to be a little bit more kind of constructive feedback in terms of, let's say, how can we make any of these ideas work? So again, it's probably my favorite decision making process, but it takes a lot of consideration. So going to the the last part that I think of good decision, right, is it helps people get clear to their goals, is made with the most relevant information. But also the third part was it is based on priorities that people care about. Here's something that I think a lot of teams underestimate, is like, we tend to underestimate how unclear our priorities are. Either because of priorities, we tend to look at priorities from, let's say, is this item a priority or that item is a priority? What I would suggest to do is maybe, let's say, not focus on each individual item, but think about, like, what is a priority policy? What is a priority criteria? Because that makes the decision-making process a lot more iterative and agile, right? So here's something that, I mean, if you haven't been confronted with that yet, I'll break it very, very, very quickly to you. Priorities make things happen, right? I've seen a lot of teams get stuck on, let's say, especially if you have a very motivated and creative team, right? Say there's more ideas than there's time for us to implement things. Well, priorities, a clear sense of priorities, make things happen. The challenge, though, is that priorities should be based on some sort of objective criteria of why things are priority and other things are not priority, right? So if let's say if we have a vision that we want to deliver, but then people think later in the process, like, yeah, but we can only do 3 out of the 5 things that we wanted to do, and people can pick, let's say, yeah, but I just take in consideration like what are the quickest one or the fastest ones. If those 3 or fastest or quickest ones do not help us bring us closer to the vision, then then we pick the wrong priorities, right? So what I mean by priorities make things happen, it's not just randomly or inconsistent way of prioritizing things, right? Let's say making sure that the priorities get people to focus on what is important, right? And again, I'll just share a couple of prioritization methods. The first one is the design criteria canvas, right? Like, this is probably one of the hardest ones, but it's probably the most useful one in a sense. Let's say, instead of having to discuss every time what is priority for a project, what if we were able to pre-decide, right? Because usually the challenge with vision, for example, vision is probably the most powerful way of prioritizing things, but the problem is sometimes the vision tends to be a little abstract, or sometimes the vision tends to be too big and the decisions that we're dealing are very specific and small, right? So what if we were able to come up with a way to pre-decide? And I'm going to share some examples of some of these prioritization methods later. But basically the thing to remember is the decision criteria is basically a way to pre-decide by creating boundary conditions around decisions, right? The other one, Uxi Matrix, was created by a good friend of mine, John Innes, which is, what if we were able to, instead of talking abstractively about the items on our backlog, which is usually tends to be where most of the decisions tend to break, right? Let's say you have a bunch of things that you need to work on, but there's only so many that can be worked on release. What if we were to bring up to visibility all the aspects of what it takes to prioritize something, right? So basically, the Uxi Matrix is a visualization tool to help facilitate the conversations around priorities, right? Outcome-driven innovation is probably one of my favorites, because at least, I mean, I know that this is a series about project management, but in my experience, I've been doing a lot of strategy work. And usually a lot of the decisions towards the implementation side of things tend to break down in the beginning, actually, because we tend to pick, let's say, we tend to disagree on what is that the customers want. Let's say, and basically this is, I know sounds very simplistic, but this is actually where the method came from. Let's say, if we were able to answer this one question, it's like, what's that customers want? Then we would basically design our products around that thing. Well, without sounding, I know it sounds like a very presumptions statement to make, but that's literally where the outcome-driven innovation comes from. It's like the idea of try to systematize ways of identifying like what are the uncovered needs that users have, and design the products around it, right? So it's try to link the company's value creation to the desired outcomes from the side of the customer. And if you haven't, unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably heard of this terminology called jobs to be done, right? So that basically the outcome-driven innovation basically is the idea of identifying what are the jobs to be done, or let's say, what are the things that our customers want to get done, and find out a way to prioritize based on what are the things that they care the most about. And we're going to talk a little bit later on how is this a good prioritization method, but I'll get to that in a second. The easiest one, and my suggestion is, like, I've seen teams kind of arrive, let's say, almost have like a Cartaz's experience once they get familiar with this prioritization grid, is just literally find ways to turn the conversation into more objective by creating prioritization grids. Let's say use axes to put the information out, and I'll share the example in a second. And I'm afraid I'm not going to have time to cover the last one, but probably the most systematic one is called the OGSM, right? So objectives, goals, strategy, and measures. which is basically is like almost like a detailed blueprint of your strategy. Let's say make it visible to everyone. What are the objectives of the project? What are the goals? And so on. So let's look at some of the examples of each of these. The design criteria or Moscow canvas basically is like you're predefining upfront what are the must things that we are going to work on. What are the things that are non-negotiable? What are the things that we should, which is like these are important things that that we need to consider. What are the coulds? That means, let's say, these are, if we have the time, we could work on these things. And my experience is usually what usually ends up happening is that we never have the time, but we could still put it as negotiable, right? Let's say, because the problem is, like, I think a lot of teams, they get stuck on, we could do this, we could do that. Let's say, good, we could, let's put them on the backlist, on the backlog, but let's frame them as could. That means that they should have less priority than should and must. Right. The other thing that I think is very important to talk about in the design criteria canvas or the Moscow canvas is that there are things that we won't do, right? And the one here is very good because that means that there's a bunch of conversations that we kind of stop having, right? This is the stuff that I notice that teams tend to get stuck, is like we keep revisiting decisions because there are things that are not part of our strategy or a roadmap that keeps coming back to life, discussion after discussion. Right? So the other prioritization method that I mentioned was the Uxi Matrix, right? Let's say from my friend John Ennis. And basically what it does is and probably this is like an overkill for a lot of the small projects, but if you're looking at things at a portfolio level, these are really great, right? Because you have items of things. Items here, the list on a table are ideas or opportunities or experiments, whatever is that you're using to as a unit of work of your team. You put them on the lines of a table, and then on the columns you put things like all the criteria that you want to take in consideration to make a decision. Let's say, who are the affected personas, what is our estimation, and so on. So basically what the Uxi Matrix does is it makes it very visible what is that we should be taking in consideration to make a decision. It's not about, let's say, we only work on the items that they get like a score of X on the formula, but it helps make the discussions a little bit more objective. Then the outcome-driven innovation, which is probably, from a strategy perspective, is probably the most useful. The one that I tend to use the most is once you have a list of jobs to be done, or once you have, let's say, what are some of the things you identified of what customers want, then the ODI, what it does, it provides a more objective way of ranking the opportunity of something based on real input from users, right? So for example, once you put them in front of a list of jobs to be done, you ask them like, how important are any of these jobs to you? Which is usually the question that most product managers or any kind of discovery team tend to ask for. Say, oh, can you please rank how important, or let's say, what is priority for you? That part of the equation, I think, is very easy. Like we've been doing very consistently as a software development industry, or at least I hope. Right. The problem, the second part of the ODI that we don't do is the satisfaction side of things. Like, well, how satisfied you are with any of these jobs. And what ends up happening is that with these two pieces of information, we end up ranking some opportunities as higher or lower. Let's say some markets are overserved, right? Let's say some features customers find it either important or maybe not as important, and they are already satisfied with the offering from the market. So try to put more features on that space. Ends up that you're having to compete for other things other than the features themselves, but for example, for price, right? So that's where, for example, all the Chinese knockoffs are coming from. Let's say there's like, if you try to go into that space, you're going to compete with thousands, maybe millions of other products that do exactly the same thing. So in that space, you end up competing on price. So if you're not able to compete on price, then you might as well not invest on that. On the other hand, is like if you have features or if you have jobs that are extremely important for customers and they are extremely dissatisfied with what is offered by the competition, that's usually when you have an opportunity to disrupt, right? Say, and from a strategy perspective, you should probably prioritize on those. And I purposely not going to talk about the formula. How does Anthony Wu arrives at these opportunity scores? If you want to know more about the formula, I'm going to share a link on the description that you can take a look at it. And the last one, for the interest of time, I guess I'm going to only talk about this one other prioritization method, which is prioritization grids, right? There's no one right way of creating prioritization grids, but what it does is like what grids do in general is like you help the team arrive at some sort of prioritization criteria based on agreed upon criteria upfront. Because usually what happens, let's look at the example on the left, right? Say the value and feasibility, right? Let's rank what are the opportunities that we have that deliver the highest value to the user. Well, that's usually the criteria that designers tend to focus on, right? Let's say we tend to kind of feel responsible for representing the voice of the user. But then the team has, let's say, especially the development teams, they have pressure to deliver. So for them, when they are looking at a feature, they're looking at feasibility. To me is important, right? So let's say feasibility in the sense, let's say, can I deliver this or not? Why am I going to go into the unnecessary risk of trying to start something that I cannot finish within the expectations of my stakeholders, right? In the case of the engineering manager or the product manager. So that's where prioritization grids get really useful. For example, in the example of the left, you have a axis called value to the user in the vertical axis, and then on the horizontal axis you have feasibility for the teams, right? So that means that there are some items that if they are high value to the user and highly feasible from the team perspective, then you have a whole quadrant or a grid of no-brainers, right? We should definitely work on it. But on the other hand, is like if you have features that have little value to the user and are highly unfeasible for the team, one could argue, like, should we even work on these things? Like, is it wise to work on these things, right? The example on the right here is like other priorities, right? Let's say some things are important regardless of what value. I mean, and here again, going back to the criteria, like what let's have a conversation about what important really means, right? Important could, from the user experience side of things, could be value to the user, right? But from the product management side of things, important could be it help us achieve a specific company initiative. From the development side of things, important means it help us our code be more scalable, refactorable, and so on, right? And another criteria could be urgent, right? Say there's pressure for us to work on these things. So this is the Eisenhower Matrix, right? Say some things we should do immediately because they're urgent and important, right? Other things are important but not urgent, so maybe we decide to work on them later. Some things are urgent but not important, so that means maybe we delegate to someone else. And definitely others are not important and not urgent, so we should get them out of our way, right? So, and as I said, there's the OGSM, but I'm afraid we're not gonna have time to talk about this time. But I'll make sure that I'll share some links for you to take a look at it. But here are a couple of things that I want to leave you with, right? Say, regardless of what is the decision-making process, what you want is to get people to commit, right? So at some point, you have the intention, we made a decision, but it's not the same as doing. Without action, the value of the best alternative is just potential value, right? So converting potential value into real value requires action. So that means you have to get the team to commit in a course of action, because without commitment, advice giving, let's say from that perspective, let's say you are a facilitator or you are a designer or you are a developer, whatever role you have, and you share your opinion with the team, if they don't commit to work on that opinion, then your advice is just an expression of your opinions, right? So, which brings us to the most important principle here. Without action, the value potential in a decision cannot really realize, right? So, and here's something that, and here's the last thing I'm gonna share with you in this presentation, and I'm afraid we're gonna have to leave with that, is the cost of changing our mind. And I know that I said in the beginning that it's okay to change your mind if you learn something new, but I think the risk that we have is, like, I've seen kind of the extreme examples that the teams keep changing their minds all the time. Let's say as a specific, as we approach the deliverable, we learn something new and then we have to change, especially in the design side of things. Like if scope changes or priorities change, they might have a drastic impact on the design, right? And you've probably been in some of these projects where the designer gets asked to make some drastic changes on the last minute. From a employee perspective, from an employee engagement perspective, this definitely sucks, right? I say nobody wants to kind of work over the weekends and holidays or overnight to kind of make changes that we could have taken more aggressively during the the life cycle. But the other thing I think is probably more critical from a decision-making process is this. Sometimes if we change our minds later, like late into the process, is like, do we have time to reconsider, like, what are the consequences and the trade-offs of that decision, right? And I think, let's say, I've noticed that, let's say, when you try to put it into perspective in terms of using a graph or something like this, it becomes very obvious, like, why we should avoid making changes late in the game, right? Because the cost of reversing those changes, or the cost of making those changes, actually goes exponentially as you get closer to the end of the life cycle, right? So, for example, if at the requirements phase, if people could say, like, we could do this or that, the designers can change the designs and it's no big deal, or during the analysis, the implementation. But as you get closer to production, then it becomes really expensive. Let's say some of the changes are either very hard to make or sometimes nearly impossible, right? Which is why I suggest, and especially as a facilitator, that you kind of have a tool set of questions, frameworks, and methods that help people facilitate the kind of the right decisions at the right phase of the process, right? Some phases tend to be very divergent by nature. Some phases tend to be convergent by nature. But what you want to do is you want to make sure that we spend enough time on each phase of the process, and you kind of answer the right questions and make the right decisions, in the hopes that you don't have to revisit a lot of these decisions later. And I'm not trying, I mean, here's something that I want to make sure that I make myself clear. There's virtually no project whatsoever that you make a decision and move on and never revisit. What you want to avoid, though, is this, not to kind of keep revisiting decisions because we don't know any better, right? We should have a plan of, let's say, like, what is the hypothesis we have? How we're going to validate our hypothesis? What is the cheapest way that we can learn about something so that we can decide, iterate, learn, and then execute, right? I know that this was much longer than the other videos that I shared with you, but I really thank you for showing up for the part 4 of this part 5 5-part series. I'm sharing, let's say if you're looking at the screen right now, there's a QR code for an article that you're gonna see a lot more in depth of these of these some of these methods. So I'm really thankful for you stopping by, and I'm just gonna put just a quick reminders here, right? So facilitation is not just about the workshops, it's about getting people to commit on a course of action. A good decision helps people get closer to their goals, is made with relevant information, and is based on priorities that they care about. And if you can't make decisions quickly and effectively and execute them on consistently, you're gonna lose ground. So thank you again for stopping by on this series. I'll make sure that I'll share the links to these resources, and I hope to see you next time.